Devil Exposed, Part 2, by Matthew Cox. Narrated by Sean Milo. The cover-up officially began in August 1996, when Special Agent Blum requested a meeting with FBI agent Bruce Burroughs, the head of the Operation Avalanche Task Force. It's unclear precisely what sparked the meeting. Nonetheless, it can be inferred that Barrero and Blum realized they weren't going to be able to help Rausini, and therefore decided to begin covering their tracks. At that meeting, Blum confessed that he had nonetheless participated in an unauthorized operation to deceive Estes into believing that a corrupt FBI agent existed, and that Estes could bribe this agent to make his case go away. Blum later changed his story. In October 1996, Burroughs told Detective Peretta that both agents Barrero and Blum, as well as Farchione, whom Barrero had posing as the corrupt FBI agent, had participated in an unauthorized investigation to trick Estes into believing that a corrupt federal agent existed. Burroughs also reported that Blum had admitted to having disseminated confidential law enforcement information to Barrero, which was passed on to Farchione, so that Farchione could establish his bona fides with Estes. However, instead of informing Burroughs that they'd received $100,000 from Estes and had leaked that Estes was an FBI informant, Blum falsely claimed that they had only shared harmless information. Regardless, Burroughs, the head of the FBI's San Francisco Drug Task Force, now knew that his agents had been lying to the homicide detectives, thus obstructing the murder investigation, for well over a year, in addition to having participated in an unsanctioned operation which resulted in Estes' murder. Nonetheless, Burroughs didn't reprimand Blum or launch an investigation into Barrero's activities. Instead, he contacted Detective Peretta and glossed over the inaccurate nature of the information Blum and Barrero had previously provided. Peretta, however, did not share Burroughs' nonchalant attitude. On November 4, 1996, at a hotel in Hollywood, FBI agent Burroughs, Detective Peretta, and David Hall, one of the prosecutors assigned to Rausini's case, met with Barrero and Farchione. The agent and his informant insisted that they did not accept any money from Estes, and that if Estes had paid any money, Rausini must have kept it. Farchione reported that Rausini had confessed to killing both Ellenberger and Estes. According to Farchione and Barrero, Rausini had murdered both men for fear they would ultimately cooperate against him. Farchione reported that both men had been fatally shot, that Rausini had shot both men, and that Rausini and an associate had buried Ellenberger's body in the desert. No one bothered to ask Farchione or his handler, Barrero, why neither of them had previously reported that Rausini had confessed to having committed 2 murders, nor had they inquired as to why the agent or his informant hadn't reported Ellenberger's murder during the preceding 18-month period. By January 1997, Rausini concluded that Farchione and Barrero had abandoned him, so he decided to play his trump card and asked his lawyer to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office and offer his cooperation in connection with corrupt law enforcement and the Estes murder. Unexpectedly, the U.S. prosecutor responded, "The only way my office will consider cooperation from Rausini is if he agrees to plead to life." The subtext being the San Francisco U.S. Attorney's Office wasn't interested in pursuing corrupt law enforcement. By this point, John Lyons, one of the assistant U.S. attorneys on Rausini's case, Hall, and Burroughs were already actively covering up the FBI task force's misconduct. On July 30, 1997, Agent Barrero appeared before the grand jury. He testified that Ellenberger had agreed to cooperate and was scheduled to sign up as an informant on the very day he disappeared, which was untrue. Moreover, he stated in the Estes matter that he and Farchione had participated in a ruse to deceive Estes into believing that a corrupt FBI agent existed whom Estes could bribe. Specifically, the agent testified that they, Rausini, Estes, Robles, Aria, and Joey, thought that Mr. Farchione had a contact in North California that was a law enforcement contact, and that Mr. Farchione had the ability to dispose of charges. Farchione had indicated that his contact was a DOJ, Department of Justice, agent. A couple of months earlier, however, Barrero told Burroughs and Detective Peretta that Farchione had portrayed himself as an FBI agent at his direction. In contrast, Farchione later claimed that at no time did he ever represent himself as a federal agent. When he appeared before the grand jury on February 6, 1997, He testified that the actions he undertook during the Operation Avalanche investigation were at the direction of FBI agents Barrero and Blum, and in a moment of unguarded candor, Farchione let it slip out that he expected the agents to give me some kind of payment out of the $150,000 Estes was paying to get his case disposed of. Around the same time, Farchione learned that Rausini had offered to cooperate. This triggered a flurry of calls and meetings between Farchione and Harrison, the purpose of which was to concoct a story, setting Rausini up as the fall guy for the Estes murder in order to deflect attention away from them. This prompted Harrison to hold a series of meetings at his girlfriend's, Odalis Melendez's, residence, one of which, in mid-February 1997, was attended by all the players: Farchione, Harrison, Aranaga, Alonzo, Mrozek, Nason, and the two thugs that disposed of Ellenberger's body, Dean Zaroli and Kelly Davis, as well as unknown men, one of whom Harrison's girlfriend identified as John from Beverly Hills. It is believed that this individual was Arya Nakjivani. Farchione explained that Rausini was looking to cut a deal, and that they needed to get their story straight to protect themselves. While the men held their meeting in the living room, Melendez waited in her bedroom, where she overheard aspects of the conversation taking place. During the course of the meeting, Melendez heard the men concoct a story about Rausini being responsible for killing both men. The final version, concocted under Farchione's guidance, being that Rausini murdered Estes and Ellenberger by shooting both men. A few months after the formation of the scheme, the FBI began questioning the conspirators. On July 31, 1997, Farchione was examined by the detectives from the LAPD's Elite Robbery Homicide Special Division. He held firm to the story that Rausini was responsible for killing both men. He did, however, admit he'd stolen over $100,000 from Ellenberger and Rausini during the Robles investigation. At a subsequent interview conducted by the detectives, Farchione claimed that, although Barrero wasn't involved in the theft of the $100,000, his FBI handler was aware of the incident. During the same time period, Aranaga was questioned by the FBI in Los Angeles. He also told them the murder was a spontaneous act, and that he had no prior knowledge that Estes was going to be killed. He added, however, that, at Rossini's direction, he'd purchased the Cannon brand towels that were used to stop the blood flow. At a follow-up interview on August 6th, Aranaga reiterated the same information. He was then given a polygraph, which he promptly failed. He then changed his story, reporting that he knew Rausini was going to kill Estes when he accompanied him to the beach house. Aranaga then failed a second polygraph on August 26th, and once again he changed his story, this time stating that not only did he know about the murder, but that he disposed of the murder weapon. Aranaga insisted, however, that Rausini was the actual murderer. On September 3, 1997, Aranaga failed a third polygraph. Once again, he altered his story. This time he indicated Harrison committed the murder. In addition to identifying Harrison as the shooter, he claimed Rausini ordered the murder to keep Estes from cooperating. During the interview, he expressed his belief that the murder may have had something to do with a crooked agent. On October 2, 1997, a second superseding indictment was returned. That indictment charged Rausini with participating in a drug conspiracy to distribute cocaine and methamphetamine, and with operating a continuing criminal enterprise. It also alleged Rausini, Harrison, Nason, and Mrozek killed Estes to prevent him from cooperating, and that Rausini killed Ellenberger during the narcotics conspiracy. Following his arrest on October 8th, FBI agents questioned Mrozek. During his interview, he indicated he could not identify the person who shot Estes. He also claimed that Rausini had stated that the victim was an informant, and he saw Rausini leave with the murder weapon. Prior to his next interview, however, Mrozek was given a polygraph, which he failed. Thereafter, Mrozek changed his story. This time, he claimed that Rausini was responsible for killing Estes. Harrison was arrested by the FBI the next day. During his interview, he claimed that Rausini fatally shot Estes at the beach house, and that he, Harrison, had no idea that Rausini planned on killing Estes. Alonzo was interviewed by LAPD detectives the following week. On October 15th, he reported that while he had no specific knowledge of either of the homicides, other than rumors, he'd seen Rausini carrying firearms. In addition, Alonzo stated Rausini had a relationship with a corrupt cop who'd tipped him off that Estes was an FBI informant. 2 days later, on October 17th, Alonso changed his story, this time reporting that Rausini and Nason killed Ellenberger, that Nason committed the homicide, that Rausini disposed of the body, and that Rausini paid for the murder. Specifically, he stated he'd seen the bloodstains from the gunshot wounds. With respect to the Estes murder, Alonso claimed that he'd heard that Rausini had killed Estes, and had done so because he was an informant. A month later, Alonso once again changed his story, this time stating that Harrison was responsible for killing Estes, and that during the murder, Rausini ran and hid in the garage. The evidence was so overwhelming that the government began talking about seeking the death penalty. As a result, the court assigned Rausini new counsel that were qualified to handle a capital prosecution. George J. Katsourelos Jr. and Michael N. Burt took over the case in October 1997. They reviewed the evidence, met with Rausini several times, and listened to his version of the events. In November 1997, AUSA Hall presented Rausini's new attorneys with a plea bargain of life imprisonment. "You need to understand, if you reject the offer," said Katsourelos, "the government intends to seek authorization from the Attorney General to ask for the death penalty." "I'm rejecting the offer," he replied. "I'm being framed. I didn't kill Lance. I didn't kill John. Harrison and his friends are all lying." By 1998, the Justice Department was battling allegations of federal agent misconduct on 3 fronts. In Boston, in the Salem case, the government was scrambling to cover up the Whitey Bulger-related misconduct, which threatened to undermine the validity of well over a dozen mafia convictions. While in San Francisco, agent misconduct was threatening to undermine the Siriprechapong prosecution. In New York, the government was desperate to contain the fallout from the Scarpa-related disclosures that resulted in several mafioso having their convictions vacated and placing more than a dozen other convictions in jeopardy. Weeks later, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a front-page expose on Rausini's case titled, "Defense in Murder Case May Implicate State. Dealer Lured to His Death by Informant." The article focused on the allegations of law enforcement complicity in the Estes murder. Within the story, the FBI's informant, Farchione, was exposed for playing a role in the events that culminated in the murder. Homicide Detective Peretta accused the FBI task force of concealing information that was material to his investigation. "When I find out how much this informant was involved, I was sitting here at my desk with my mouth open." The Bureau went over the line. The article concluded with an observation that federal officers were openly worrying that the agent's role in Estes' death may undermine the entire case against Rausini and his co-defendants. Following the Chronicle's expose, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of California, Michael Yamaguchi, was removed from the office and replaced later that year with Robert Mueller. As acting U.S. Attorney, Mueller announced that the Rausini prosecution was back on track and that his office would be seeking the death penalty. Shortly thereafter, Mueller announced that he would personally prosecute Rausini's case. In April 1999, the government turned over thousands of pages of additional materials in discovery. Among the materials produced were LAPD homicide reports, which indicated that 3 witnesses had reported that Nason had made statements boasting that he was a hitman and had been paid $30,000 for killing Ellenberger. That summer, Rausini's defense investigator, Paul Palladino, determined that the Save-On Drug store in Newport Beach, the store Aranaga claimed to have purchased the Estes blood flow towels from, never carried Canon brand towels, thus confirming Aranaga had fabricated the blockbuster evidence the government claimed corroborated his account. Around the same time period, the government turned over the telephone toll records of more than 100 cell phone numbers used by Rausini and various associates. Those records showed dozens of calls to and from both Farchione, Barrero, and Rausini on the day of the Ellenberger homicide and its immediate aftermath, i.e., during periods of time that the agent and his informant were denying they'd spoken with Rausini. In July 1999, the court set the trial date for spring 2000. The court ordered the government to provide all information concerning the nature and extent of Rausini's interactions with agents Barrero and Blum, as well as informant Farchione. 10 days later, on December 31, 1999, Barrero took stress disability retirement, just as Agent Gervasio had done in Siriprechapong's case. Specifically, by taking a stress disability retirement, agents cannot be compelled to provide testimony that will incriminate them. Shortly thereafter, Blum also took an early, stress-related retirement. Unbeknownst to Rausini's attorneys, the collapse of Rausini's prosecution was imminent. Just before a status hearing on January 5, 2000, Mueller approached attorney Katsiroulos. Mueller told Rausini's lawyers that he would be willing to explore a deal that didn't include Rausini's death or a life sentence. Mueller proposed a 40-year term. Rausini was in the untenable position of having to risk a jury verdict based on fabricated testimony that could result in his being executed or plead guilty. Notwithstanding his innocence, to avert the risk of a wrongful conviction and potential death sentence, Rausini agreed to negotiate a deal. The following day, the San Francisco Chronicle ran an article announcing Nason had been arrested. Although Nason refused to speak, Mueller told Katsiroulos that he had implicated Rausini in both murders, which was a lie. Rausini was in a desperate situation. After a significant amount of badgering by Katsiroulos, Rausini agreed to plead guilty to avoid a possible death sentence. What other choice did he have? "It's this, or you get the needle," said Katsiroulos. Rausini stood in front of U.S. District Judge Susan Elston on January 27, 2000. He hadn't solicited Ellenberger or Estes' murder. Unfortunately, he couldn't see an alternative to accepting the plea, at least an alternative that didn't result in his death. During the hearing, Rausini indicated that he wished to plead guilty to the solicitation counts. From the bench, Judge Elston asked, "What did you do with the money?" in reference to Estes' bribe money. "I delivered it to a government informant named Mark Farchione." The San Francisco Chronicle reported Rausini's change of plea the next day. In the course of the article, they revealed that Agent Barrero had taken stress disability retirement amidst allegations of misconduct in Rausini's case. Katsiroulos arrived at the detention center later that day. Rausini immediately pointed out Barrero's retirement. "Did you know about this?" "No, Mueller withheld it," replied Katsiroulos. "He lied. He sandbagged us." Rausini instructed his lawyer to call Mueller and tell him I want to pull my plea. The deal is off. At Katsiroulos's next visit, after speaking with Mueller, he reported that the U.S. attorney had proposed an alternative to withdrawing the plea. According to Katsiroulos, Mueller had indicated an interest in speaking with Rausini regarding the Ellenberger and Estes homicides, including the allegations of criminal misconduct involving Barrero, Blum, and Farchione. By cooperating with the government, Katsiroulos explained, Rausini could earn a significant reduction in his sentence. Katsiroulos claimed, however, that Mueller was insisting that Rausini be sentenced prior to their meeting. On May 19, 2000, Rausini was sentenced to 40 years. The headline in the San Francisco Chronicle read, "Drug Kingpin Gets 40 Years." Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary was where they sent me, says Rausini. One of the oldest federal prisons in the country, Leavenworth's 40-foot-high perimeter walls, topped by barbed wire, as well as the ever-present guards and gun towers, leaves no doubt that the prison was built to house the worst of the worst. When U.S. Attorney Mueller and Special Agent Burroughs stepped into Leavenworth Visitation Room on October 11, 2000, the issue of Farchione, Barrero, and Blum's misconduct was threatening to destroy the government's case against Nason and Harrison. The first order of business on Mueller's interview agenda were the allegations of corruption and misconduct. Although multiple individuals had made statements to the FBI and LAPD which supported an appearance of corruption, the U.S. Attorney's tone indicated Mueller wasn't convinced. Regardless, he said all the right things. "I'm only interested in the truth. If these agents engaged in criminal conduct, let the chips fall where they may." Mueller asked, "Is Blum dirty?" "I never spoke with Blum," Rausini replied. "I only dealt with Mark Farchione and Sean Barrero. Sean's dirty. Now, it's my understanding, based on conversations with Farchione, that Barrero was splitting the bribe money with Blum." The U.S. Attorney's eyes met Agent Burroughs, and he said, "It's my understanding you kept the money." "Me? No, I dropped off the money to Farchione, Barrero's bagman." Mueller asked if Rausini knew of any additional money that may have gone to the agents. Rausini began discussing nearly $200,000 in payoffs for protection and information, as well as the $1.5 million in product and $300,000 in cash that Farchione and Barrero had stolen from Ellenberger and Robles. That was a couple of years before the Estes thing. Mueller cut Rausini off. He wanted to focus on the allegations of improper conduct in connection with the Operation Avalanche investigation underlying Rausini's prosecution. Burroughs pulled out a legal pad and pen. and Mueller asked Rausini about Estes' bribe payments. Rausini explained that he and Nason had met with Farchione at the Mondrian Hotel in West L.A., as Burroughs scribbled away on his legal pad. Rausini discussed the circumstances surrounding the delivery of the initial $50,000 payment. What was the $100,000 for? That's what Barrero was charging to tank the case. This seemed to agitate Mueller, and he redirected the line of questions away from Barrero and Blum to the Estes homicide. You asked Harrison to kill Estes. Why? First off, I never asked anyone to kill Lance Estes. Barrero said there was an informant in Estes' organization. According to Barrero, the informant had provided the information that led to Meacham being arrested and $200,000 worth of ice being seized. But I never suspected Estes of being the snitch. Then why was he killed? Because Farchione said he was a threat. After Estes tried to back out of the arrangement, he became a liability. Barrero and Farchione were exposed. Rausini described the meeting where Farchione told Harrison that Estes was an informant and to kill him. But he didn't want it done in San Francisco. Estes lived with his girlfriend. Rausini explained that Farchione instructed Harrison to kill Estes in Los Angeles and to make sure no one found the body. Rausini disclosed that Barrero had leaked to Farchione that Estes had agreed to cooperate with the FBI. Unbeknownst to Rausini at the time, but known to Mueller, Estes had also offered to cooperate against corrupt law enforcement in exchange for consideration in his case. This made him a liability. Barrero and Farchione, as co-conspirators, would have been vulnerable to conviction. Barrero was knee-deep in this thing. Farchione ordered the hit after he, Barrero, leaked the information about Estes being an FBI informant. Wait a minute, you don't know that, Mueller countered. Even if what you're saying is true, it's not conclusive proof that Agent Barrero was involved. You don't have direct knowledge. Of course he was involved. He leaked the information. Also, while Barrero was a Northern California agent, he wasn't on the San Francisco task force. He was based in Silicon Valley. Blum, on the other hand, was. Therefore, Blum had to have given the information to Barrero. Barrero might as well have pulled the trigger. Agent Barrero did not pull the trigger, snapped Mueller. What did he think was going to happen when he identified Estes as a snitch? Asked Rausini. Did he think these guys were going to thank Estes for helping take a bite out of crime? The blood drained from Mueller's face. According to Rausini's information, Mueller was now the lead prosecutor in a case involving an agent that had leaked confidential law enforcement information, setting in motion a chain of events that culminated in the murder of an FBI informant. Mueller then asked about the weapon used to kill Ellenberger. Ellenberger wasn't shot, gasped Rausini out of exasperation at Mueller's ignorance. Nason choked him out. Then why'd you plead guilty? I was looking at catching the death penalty on false charges based on fabricated evidence that your witnesses colluded to manufacture. Mueller asked who had paid Nason the $30,000 he claimed to have been paid for killing Ellenberger, but Rausini didn't know. Nor did he know the individuals who Nason had made those statements to. The more Rausini spoke, the more it became apparent that the government's case was based on lies. Rausini could almost feel the knot in the pit of Mueller's stomach. Rausini explained that after he'd found Ellenberger dead, Rausini called Farchione, whom federal law enforcement had led him to believe was an FBI agent, who instructed him to get rid of the body. Didn't you check the phone records? What records? Asked Mueller. Rausini explained that the cell phone billing records proved he'd spoken with Farchione and Barrero multiple times on the day of the murder, as well as a couple dozen times within the next 2 weeks. Mueller looked ill at the revelation. When Mueller asked about the bloodstains Alonzo had seen, Rausini almost laughed. There were no bloodstains because there were no gunshot wounds. Nason choked Ellenberger out. Rausini challenged Mueller to explain how Alonzo's story had matched Harrison's and Farchione's when all three men had reported the same false, fabricated, and physically impossible acts. What did the forensic examiners say? I know they couldn't have found any evidence of blood. Mueller reluctantly admitted the FBI and LAPD's top forensic examiners hadn't found any forensic evidence. Both of his high-profile cases were falling apart. Rausini told Mueller that Harrison and Nason's lawyers knew that Farchione and Barrero were dirty. They know your witnesses' statements are concocted. Read Harrison's girlfriend's grand jury transcript. Your witnesses were all attending meetings. Melendez overheard them discussing different scenarios in which I shot both men. Harrison and Nason's lawyers had to know that your witnesses concocted their stories, because when they made it all up, their clients were at the meetings. Barrero's dirty, and the FBI's Operation Avalanche Task Force was leaking like a sieve, said Rausini. You're heading for a fucking shipwreck. Mueller was 3 months away from a high-profile trial in which he now knew multiple witnesses, including 2 agents and an informant, were lying. The government's theory of prosecution was profoundly flawed. We're going to investigate the information you've provided, and if we can corroborate it, we'll be back. 2 weeks later, Mueller and Burroughs returned to Leavenworth to speak with Rausini. He was led back into the visitation room, where U.S. Attorney Mueller and Agent Burroughs were waiting for him. Mueller admitted they had been able to corroborate much of Rausini's information. Mueller's polish seemed slightly tarnished when he said, "We need your help." He confided that the government was in the position of having to reevaluate their entire theory of prosecution on the eve of trial. "We need your assistance immediately." "And what do I get?" Mueller gave Rausini his word that he'd ask the judge to reduce his sentence. "I want that in writing. None of this discretionary stuff." Rausini and Mueller entered into a cooperation agreement that was formalized into a written agreement 2 weeks later and executed by Rausini and returned to Mueller. Over the course of the next 2 days, Rausini, once again, laid out the story, as Burroughs jotted away on his pad. Rausini slowly broke down the events as Mueller fleshed out the elements of Farchione and Barrero's involvement in the circumstances that culminated in the Ellenberger and Estes murders. At the end of the 3rd day, around 3 p.m., Mueller pulled a photo out of his file and flashed it at Rausini. It was Aria Nakjivani. "Do you know this person?" "That's Aria." Rausini had always wondered if Aria had paid Nason to kill Ellenberger. He and Jenny had recently been married. However, he'd never had anything more than speculation. "How long have you known?" "We've had our suspicions for some time." Mueller told Rausini that after their October 11th debriefing, Mueller had gone back and examined the telephone toll records and discovered something very interesting. The records indicated that following Rausini's discovery of Ellenberger's body, shortly after 1 p.m., he had made a series of phone calls. When he spoke to Nason, who was at Aria's place in Beverly Hills, Rausini indicated that there was an urgent issue and that they needed to meet. Nason had to have known Rausini had found the body. Shortly after Nason left to meet Rausini, Aria placed a call to Joey Escoboza. Joey, who hadn't called Ellenberger in months, immediately called Ellenberger's pager number. Exactly 1 hour later, after Ellenberger failed to call Joey back, Aria called Joey to see if he'd heard from Ellenberger. It appears Nakjivani and Escoboza attempted to contact Ellenberger to verify Nason's story that he'd killed Ellenberger. Ellenberger, of course, never called back. The number of suspicious circumstances are accumulating. What neither Rausini nor Mueller knew was that the day after the homicide, May 20th, 1995, Nason collected $30,000 from Aria. Then there were the statements made by several individuals regarding Nason being a hitman. By the end of the debriefing, Burroughs had taken 64 pages of notes. They were gathering their things as Mueller told Rausini he was going to have him moved back to the West Coast. He spoke about indicting Farchione and Barrero for criminal conduct and, more importantly, for their roles in the Estes homicide. "I'm going to need you to testify in front of the grand jury." "Mueller didn't indict them, did he?" I asked. Based on Rausini's distant gaze and the remaining length of his sentence, I already knew the answer. "No, not even close," he replies. In retrospect, Rausini doesn't believe the U.S. attorney ever considered going after Farchione, Barrero, or Blum. Had any evidence corroborating Rausini's account been developed, Mueller very well may have gone down with the ship. He'd been appointed to the San Francisco U.S. Attorney's Office specifically to clean it up. Had the misconduct that occurred in connection with the Operation Avalanche investigation come out, it may very well have ruined Mueller's political ambitions. He was within weeks of the presidential election, and within months of being named the next Attorney General. Mueller wasn't going to let crooked agents, a drug dealer, and a dead snitch change that. The documentation is overwhelming that U.S. Attorney Mueller and Agent Burroughs, from this point forward, did everything in their power to cover up law enforcement complicity in the Estes murder. Specifically, the evidence shows that Mueller and Burroughs condensed their notes of Rausini's debriefing and then fabricated an FBI report. While crafting the report, They omitted that Rausini had denied responsibility for ordering the murders. In addition, they neglected to mention that Rausini had identified Barrero as the individual who had leaked that Estes was an FBI informant, as well as the fact that Farchione had ordered the Estes murder. Mueller then used the report to convince both Nason and Harrison that Rausini was going to testify against them. Expressly in Nason's case, Mueller stated, "Rausini will testify that he directed the defendant to kill Ellenberger, and he did so to prevent him from cooperating." With that, both Nason and Harrison pled guilty. Each of them were sentenced to 25 years. Mueller went before the Senate Judiciary Committee on July 31, 2001. Undoubtedly to Mueller's disappointment, newly elected President Bush had nominated John Ashcroft for the coveted position of Attorney General. As a consolation, however, the president had nominated Mueller for FBI Director. Although his confirmation was assured, the issue of the FBI's recent debacles was raised. "The FBI is suffering a management culture so arrogant that ignoring the rules and covering up is the order of the day," said Senator Chuck Grassley while peering at Mueller. "Do you believe there is a culture problem within the Bureau?" "I think it is absolutely unacceptable to try to cover up and not disclose something that needs to be disclosed," replied Mueller. "And, more importantly, or as importantly, it's unacceptable to try to shift blame to someone else." Mueller had no worries. At this point, the cover-up was on autopilot. The court system itself simply had to keep Rausini in prison. Based on the sensitive nature of the case, the district court and the U.S. Attorney's Office would continue to seal all records, while the Bureau of Prisons would keep a tight rein on Rausini's ability to speak with the press. Then, on December 6, 2002, in response to a motion filed by Rausini's attorney regarding Mueller's agreement to reduce his client's sentence for cooperation, AUSA Hall told the court, "At no time was Rausini promised any deal or reduction of his sentence by Mueller or Burroughs." Hall just straight up lied, says Rausini. He rummages through a file and pulls out a copy of the agreement he entered into with Mueller. The language was clear. In January 2006, Rausini's attorney asked the court to enforce the contract. During the hearing, in front of Judge Ilston, Hall downplayed the significance of Rausini's cooperation and avoided any mention of the dirty agents. Instead, he told the court, "When Mr. Rausini talked to the government, he denied that he solicited the murders. All in all, we believe that Mr. Rausini deserves very little credit." Hall argued the court should sentence Rausini to what he agreed to from the beginning, 20 years for each solicitation count. Judge Ilston nodded her understanding and asked Rausini if he had anything he would like to say. "Your Honor," he said, "I disagree with what Mr. Hall said." Rausini then abruptly pointed to the U.S. prosecutor and said, "Mr. Hall has been covering up from day one the agents involved in these murders." Hall threw up his arms and huffed in protest. Unfortunately, the judge reduced Rausini's 40-year sentence by 2 years. Rausini appealed the judge's decision to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and in June 2008, the court found that the government had intentionally violated Rausini's due process rights by breaching the terms of the cooperation agreement. The appeal court then reversed Judge Ilston's decision. AUSA Hall stepped aside, and the U.S. Attorney's Office assigned AUSA Wilson Long and Robert Rees to handle the case. Over the course of the next 3 years, Rausini's attorney made repeated requests for Mueller and Burroughs' handwritten notes. Long repeatedly stated that the government could not locate the notes. In June 2011, Judge Marilyn Patel, the newly assigned judge, held an evidentiary hearing to explore Rausini's claims. During the government's questioning of former Supervisory Special Agent Burroughs, he claimed that Rausini had admitted responsibility for orchestrating the murders during his interviews with Mueller. Did he ever, in any way, claim that there was a concocted conspiracy to frame him? No. Were you or Mueller investigating in any way any kind of official misconduct or any kind of cover-up? No. Throughout the course of his testimony, Burroughs relied upon the fabricated FBI report. When Rausini's attorney, Vermeulen, cross-examined Burroughs regarding whether all of Rausini's information had been documented in the report, Burroughs explained that the report was a summary of what was said during the 3 days, and assured the court anything of substance that was discussed was memorialized in the 302. Vermeulen asked a number of questions, but Burroughs recalled very little. For the most part, he answered the bulk of the inquiries with an "I don't recall" or "not to my recollection." During cross-examination, Rausini's attorney, Vermeulen, asked questions regarding policies on drafting 302 reports. Burroughs admitted he'd used his notes. "Did you keep your notes after you drafted it?" "I believe I did. They should be in the file." Vermeulen turned to the judge and said, "If there are notes that exist concerning the debriefing of Mr. Rausini, we should have those." AUSA Reese then told the court that he could only assume that those notes have been destroyed or are no longer in existence. He went on to say that he would arrange to meet with Burroughs at the FBI's field office and try and locate the notes. Vermeulen asked Burroughs, "Is it your testimony that during the debriefing in October that there was no discussion between Pierre Rausini and Bob Mueller concerning corrupt agents or potential corrupt agents?" "The only discussion that I recall was Rausini's reference to the fact that he thought Sean Barrero was a dirty FBI agent," spat the former agent, "and Mark Farchione was someone that was working undercover with Sean." Burroughs then reverted to answering with "I don't recalls" and "not to my recollection" responses for the next dozen questions. By the end of the hearing, the government had turned the judge against Rausini. They had accomplished this by disputing whether Rausini had ever denied soliciting the murders, and alleging that Mueller and Rausini had never discussed the issue of law enforcement corruption. Shortly thereafter, the government miraculously located Burroughs' notes, the same notes that AUSA Lung had previously sworn didn't exist. 64 pages documenting Rausini and Mueller's discussions, with the exception of one missing page which, based on the time frame, would have contained Rausini's statements identifying Barrero as being responsible for orchestrating the Estes murder by leaking his FBI informant status. Conveniently, the government claimed, along with page 3, they were unable to locate any notes taken by Mueller. "The notes were a goldmine," Rausini tells me. They conclusively proved that Burroughs had lied during his testimony and had prepared the 302, specifically omitting significant aspects of Rausini's statement. For example, Burroughs' notes established that at the very first meeting, Note 0001, Rausini and Mueller discussed corruption. Note 0002 reflected Rausini's statements that it was Farchione, not Rausini, who instructed Harrison to kill Estes. Note 0046 indicated that Rausini told Mueller that when he left the Marina del Rey condo on the night of the Ellenberger homicide, there was no agreement with Nason to kill Ellenberger. While this information appeared in the notes, it did not appear in Burroughs' 302. By omitting this, Burroughs created the false impression that Rausini had been a party to the conspiracy. Note 0060 reflected that Rausini informed Mueller that when he met Harrison on the afternoon of August 16th, Rausini was told that a decision had been made to kill Lance Estes. Notwithstanding the notes, Burroughs drafted his 302 so that it appeared that Rausini had attended the meeting where the decision to kill Estes was made, thereby involving Rausini in the decision-making process. The notes, however, proved the 302 was inaccurate. Then there was Note 0061, which documented Rausini's discussion with Farchione, confiding Harrison was planning on murdering Estes at his residence in San Francisco, a plan which potentially included killing his fiancée, Monica Trujillo. Farchione agreed with Rausini that it was a bad plan and asked Rausini to get those guys to come to a meeting. At that meeting, Farchione told Harrison not to kill Lance Estes in San Francisco because of Monica. Rausini made it clear to Mueller that Farchione told Harrison to do the murder in L.A. and to make sure that no one finds the body. Burroughs' 302 omitted the fact that Rausini had tried to stop the murder. Instead, it implied they were collaborating. Note 0012 and 0062 reflected that Mueller was told, had Estes come to L.A. with the final payment, he would have lived. However, if he didn't have the money, Harrison and Mrozek were going to kill him. Nowhere in Burroughs' 302 does he indicate this. There were many more omissions, inaccuracies, and mischaracterizations between Burroughs' notes and his 302 report. In the end, however, after reviewing the documents, it was clear that Burroughs selectively distorted his summary of the notes in such a way as to insulate the FBI's task force, Barrero, and Farchione, while shifting blame to Rausini. Vermeulen immediately presented the court with Rossini's notes to highlight Burroughs' false testimony. "It's so obvious that he lied," I say to Rausini after reviewing the documents. "What did your attorney say?" "You know," he replies, "up to that point he'd said all the right things, but after he saw the notes, I could tell it was the first time he actually believed me." The director of the FBI, Robert Mueller, was examined on September 28, 2011, via closed-circuit monitor between the FBI San Francisco field office, where only Rausini, his attorney, prosecutor, judge, and law enforcement were present, and FBI headquarters. Mueller appeared on the large flat screen, wearing a starched suit and a scowl of irritation. AUSA Kane walked Mueller through the events that led up to his and Burroughs' debriefing with Rausini, asking, "What was the purpose of the meeting?" "To explore the possibility that Mr. Rausini would agree to cooperate in the continuing investigation and upcoming trials in exchange for consideration by the government of his cooperation." Mueller then directed the court's attention to the 302, stating that Rausini described the activities of his co-defendants while de-emphasizing his activities as the person soliciting those murders. "Did Mr. Rausini ever flat-out deny his involvement in the murders of Mr. Ellenberger and Mr. Estes?" "No, to the contrary. He implicated himself substantially in both of those murders." Rausini hadn't expected Mueller to contradict what appeared in Burroughs' notes, which clearly indicated he had denied conspiring to kill Ellenberger and showed that it was Farchione, not Rausini, that had ordered the Estes murder. He and Vermeulen were baffled by Mueller's clear representation of Rossini's statements. Kane asked if there had been any investigation into public corruption going on at the time he'd met with Rausini. "Were you hoping to obtain any information regarding public corruption?" Mueller glanced at Rausini. "I don't have any recollection of it at this time." Mueller freely admitted that he'd made an agreement with Rausini and that his cooperation was a factor in Nason's and Harrison's decision to plead guilty. Unfortunately, Mueller stated that he believed that Rausini was the person in charge, and therefore responsible for the killing of the two individuals. Rausini and Vermeulen were slack-jaw stunned by the contradictions to the handwritten notes. Mueller was blatantly lying. After Kane finished with her examination of the director, Vermeulen jumped right into the thick of the case. Despite providing Mueller with the materials the defense intended to go over, Mueller admitted he'd reviewed virtually none of the records, with the exception of the Rausini 302 report. As expected, the director answered most of Vermeulen's questions with, "I don't have a present recollection," or "Sitting here today, I can't remember." Eventually, the questions reached the content of Rossini's debriefing and precisely what was covered. "When you went to talk to Mr. Rausini, were you aware of these three people, Farchione, Barrero, and Blum? And were you aware they had been involved in the investigation of the case?" "I'm not certain." "You're not certain?" Keep in mind the agents, as well as their informant, had been all over the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle regarding their roles in the Estes murder. The homicide detective on the case had all but accused them of participating in the murder. At the time, Rossini's case was one of the highest-profile cases in Mueller's career. Yet, he could recall virtually nothing. "I'm not certain at this late date." Vermeulen, more than a little shocked at Mueller's response, went on to nudge him on the subject of the FBI's informant and the agents. "Did you have no knowledge of Farchione, Barrero, and Blum's involvement?" "At this late date, I do not know what I knew at that particular point," and Vermeulen asked if the director knew if Rausini was familiar with the FBI informant and the agents. "I would assume so, but you would have to go back to the 302. Without going back and looking at the 302, I can't recall the degree of Mr. Rossini's familiarity with each of these individuals." Vermeulen then asked the director to review the capital case submission that Nason's attorney had provided to Mueller back in 2000, prior to Mueller interviewing Rausini. The document covered the extent of Nason's involvement in the conspiracy, discussed the role that Farchione, Barrero, and Blum played in the events that led up to the homicide. "Do you recall having read this?" "I don't recall," he abruptly replied. "But I can tell you I adamantly disagree with some of the assertions that are made here." "Sure?" Vermeulen stammered, slightly confused. Mueller had just stated he didn't remember reading the report. "I'm not asking," suddenly Mueller snapped. "A police officer did not pull the trigger or kill, but "I'm not asking you to," Vermeulen interrupted. "My purpose in pointing this out is not, and tell me if I am wrong, that the role of Mr. Farchione and Mr. Barrero and Mr. Blum were at issue in the case, and their potential corruption or misconduct are at issue in the case. I just don't know at this late date." Vermeulen brought Mueller's attention to the first page of the notes, Note 0001. He placed the document on the overhead projector, then turned away from the monitor toward the gallery, where Burroughs was seated, and said, "The best that I can tell, it says the following. Mondrian Hotel. Frank and Cisco stayed at hotel with money. My room was in Johnny's name. I called Frank in room. He came down with money, $50K. I gave some to Mark. I checked into hotel on return to L.A. with money, $50K, from Lance Estes. Money was obtained from Lance at SF, San Francisco, same day. Do you recall discussing that with Pierre Rausini?" "No." The note clearly described the delivery of tens of thousands of dollars from Estes to Farchione at the Mondrian Hotel. "You don't recall that at all?" "No," replied Mueller. "I may well have, but I don't have any present recollection of the substance of the discussion we had on that day." "Did you discuss with them at all allegations of agent corruption or informant corruption or misconduct?" "I could have. I don't have a recollection today. If it's in Bruce Burroughs' 302, we did." "Is it your testimony that issues involving allegations of B&E agents and informant corruption or bribery or misconduct were not issues at all relevant to your preparations for trial against Nason and Harrison?" "What I'm saying is, I do not have a present recollection of that being a substantive issue. It may well have been an issue. If there had been, then we would have opened a separate case on those particular allegations and pursued it." Mueller went on to say, "If in the course of investigating and prosecuting this case, we had found viable issues relating to corruption of federal agents, then I would have undertaken a separate investigation of that. But I do not believe that was done." "Understood," said Vermeulen. No investigation was launched, specifically because Mueller didn't want to find evidence of corruption. "What did you do to determine whether this was viable information or potentially viable leads, including those leads provided by Rausini that would inform your decision not to launch a separate case?" "Well, we would have pursued whatever leads there were. It may well be if Mr. Rausini perceived or believed that there was some corruption," replied the director. "Whatever he gave us, which would be reflected in the 302, we would have pursued." "And reports would have been generated?" Rossini's attorney pointed out Note 0059. "I'll ask you to refer to the middle of the page. It appears to begin, 'I did another 2.5 pounds, conv,' which I believe is conversation, for Wayne. 1/2 pound to Dale, 2 pounds to Mrozak, and then, Mark tells us a couple days before, August 14, to stop doing conversions because an indictment would be coming down. Mark there refers to Farchione, does it not?" "I don't know. I presume that's the case," grumbled Mueller, irritated at Vermeulen pointing out that Mueller was clearly trying to mislead the court. "I don't know what was in Bruce Burroughs' mind when he took it down. I presume they are talking about Mark Farchione." "That is, from your discussion with Mr. Rausini, an allegation of misconduct on behalf of the B&E informant being handled by the B&E agents in this case, correct?" "Farchione was not an agent," barked Mueller. "I don't know the source of his information that an indictment was coming down. I'm not certain." AUSA Kane then clarified for the court that Farchione had represented himself as an FBI agent. Barrero was also representing himself as an FBI agent when, in fact, he was a California Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement agent who had been cross-designated as an FBI Special Federal Officer. Regardless, this made him a federal agent working for the FBI. Vermeulen switched the director's attention to Note 0002. The part that appears to begin, "Mark tells WPR, Walter Pierre Rausini, and others not to kill Lance Estes at SF residence in San Francisco because of Monica. Convince them to get Lance in LA and then, MF, fair to say refers to Mark Farchione. Make sure they don't find the body." That was something Mr. Rausini told you on the first day when you went to debrief him in connection with your discussion with him about the murders, correct? Do you know if there was any investigation? "I do not at this juncture know whether there was, but I assume there would have been at the time," he replied. He then clarified the statement by saying, "There quite probably was an investigation, but I don't recall." That was, of course, another lie. A USA Lung had previously testified that neither Mueller nor the FBI had conducted any investigation into any of Rausini's leads. In late October, you were interested in talking with Mr. Rausini about the defense that the two co-defendants might or would be raising. It may well be. I just don't have any current recollection of it, stammered Mueller. Again, I would refer you to the 302. Mueller began withdrawing into the 302 report, the official record, and avoiding the questions. I don't have an independent recollection. I do believe that my feelings back then is that the 302 accurately reflected what we discussed in the course of the meeting with Mr. Rausini. During a discussion of the manner in which Ellenberger was killed, Vermeulen pointed out that numerous witnesses had stated he was shot. However, it was Rausini that clarified the actual manner of death. Let me get straight to the point. No one other than Mr. Rausini provided information to you or law enforcement that disclosed the murder method for Ellenberger was choking rather than shooting. Isn't that fair to say? I don't know that to be the case. Can you point me to anything that would contradict that statement? I can't, stammered Mueller. What I can tell you is that I don't know. He then said that he recalled visiting the condo where the homicide occurred. A piece of carpet had been removed, cut out, in the cleanup after the murder because there was blood on it, which is not consistent with smothering. Keep in mind that Nason had pled guilty to strangling Ellenberger to death, and the forensic teams found no evidence of blood. Despite the government having abandoned their flawed theory, and Nason having pled guilty to choking him to death, Mueller continued to insist that Ellenberger had been shot. Mueller recalled very little after that. In fact, Vermeulen asked if he believed reviewing documents concerning the case would refresh the director's memory. Not after 10 years, no, replied Mueller. In certain isolated instances, yes, but I think they are few and far between. Vermeulen had additional questions. Unfortunately, his time had run out. During Rausini's testimony, his lawyer asked if Burroughs' testimony, months earlier, had been accurate. No, sir, said Rausini. First issue they wanted to discuss were the allegations being made of corruption. Rausini then walked the court through Burroughs' notes. Page 1 reflects the statement I provided concerning the circumstances surrounding the delivery of the initial $50,000 payoff to Barrero's bagman. Whatever mechanism Barrero had used to obtain the confidential information he was providing, Rausini admitted he didn't know. The most likely culprit was Agent Blum. Vermeulen then redirected Rausini's attention to Burroughs' notes and asked him to point out examples of where he discussed corruption and misconduct, which he did. Did you also discuss with Mr. Mueller misconduct and corruption in connection with the agents? Yes, sir. Rausini looked over note 0002 and said, Farchione advised Harrison that Lance was an informant for federal law enforcement, that he had gotten caught playing both sides against the middle. However, Estes had agreed to pay Farchione and Barrero to quash the case. There was no reason to kill him. The bottom line is, I didn't order it. Among other evidence, Rausini walked the court through multiple cell phone toll records, digital pager, and landline phone records, which connected Farchione and Barrero's numbers to dozens of calls, proving Farchione and Barrero had lied to the FBI and the homicide detectives. The testimony about the calls eventually led to the blood stains and a discussion about the government's witnesses. The body was never in the closet. That's why they never recovered any forensics. Alonzo and Harrison had been at the marina. They'd helped move the body. They knew Ellenberger hadn't been shot, and yet they stated Ellenberger had been shot. I explained to Mr. Mueller that what you had here were witnesses that had cooperated in this murder investigation, trying to make both homicides appear they had been done in the same manner. There's a concerted effort to say Pierre shot those guys. There was an effort to shift the blame. I'm no angel, but the bottom line is, there was an effort to make it appear as if I shot both guys. Rausini expressed his belief that Harrison's girlfriend, Odalis Melendez, testified that all of the key government witnesses met at her residence multiple times, and he believed, during those meetings, they had coordinated their stories. Did you shoot either of them? Asked Vermeulen. Did you kill either one of them? No, not at all. During the sentencing, on November 7, 2011, the judge talked about the difficulty of the case and the contradictions within the record. However, regardless of the missing evidence, the government's ever-changing positions, and their waffling witnesses, despite Mueller's lies, Patel had her mind made up. I don't know how inconsistent it is with what he told Mr. Mueller, so given all of that, it's worth something. It's worth something because he got pleas from 2 defendants. I will reduce the sentence from the 40 years that was imposed to 35 years. Rausini was not pleased, nor was his attorney. Vermeulen brought in a second attorney, Ethan Balog. Balog appealed to the Ninth Circuit, arguing that the government had breached Rausini's cooperation agreement in numerous respects. On April 26, 2013, the Ninth Circuit granted Rausini's appeal, vacated his judgment, and directed the district court to select a newly assigned judge, who on remand will hold an evidentiary hearing to assess the full scope and value of Rausini's cooperation. After a round of litigation in front of the new judge, Judge Maxine Chesney, the court ruled that the record contradicted Burroughs and Mueller's testimony. Chesney then told the government that she was prepared to hold an evidentiary hearing with Burroughs and Mueller with no time limits, unless the parties could come to an agreement and enter into a factual stipulation for the court to rely upon when assessing the government's motion to reduce Rausini's sentence. According to Balog, during a call to AUSA William Long, the government had scrapped Kane, Rees, and Hall and brought back Long. Balog told Long, "Here's what I'm thinking. I'm going to put Burroughs on the stand and prove he testified falsely. Then, what the hell, I'm going to put Mueller on the stand for a couple of days. Walk him through those notes real thoroughly. See exactly what he can recall. Because I don't believe for a second that he can't remember anything that's not in the 302. All right, grunted Long, that's not necessary. Understand that Mueller's failure to investigate Rausini's information was due to his not wanting to develop evidence of the agents' corruption and their involvement in the conspiracy to murder Estes. If Mueller failed to investigate Barrero and Farchione after getting information from Rausini, the government should have stated that, and it shouldn't have claimed that Rausini's information was uncorroborated. Mueller's failure to conduct any investigation is in and of itself evidence of bad faith. Balog and Lung bounced around several emails and calls over the next few weeks before Lung conceded. The government couldn't allow the former director of the FBI to admit that he'd lied on the witness stand. On November 6, 2013, the parties presented the court with a submission stipulating to key facts. Among other matters, the government acknowledged that, during the October 2000 briefings, Rausini walked away from his plea colloquy, and while he established his complicity in the homicides, he denied soliciting them. In sum, Rausini admitted to the Estes homicide conspiracy and implicated informant Mark Farchione and B&E agent Sean Barrero, and limited his liability for the Ellenberger homicide as an accessory after the fact. Other witnesses supported Rausini's claim that he had found Ellenberger dead and sought help with disposal of the body. In support of the stipulation, the government presented the court with a letter previously drafted by Mueller, which identified 6 categories of evidence that corroborated Rausini's account of Ellenberger's murder. And, with respect to the Estes murder, Mueller's letter indicated that Rausini's account was corroborated by evidence known to the government. Fuck! They admitted that Mueller and Burroughs lied, I interject. The government acknowledged that, contrary to Mueller's testimony, Rausini had specifically denied responsibility for soliciting both murders and, in the Ellenberger context, had expressly limited his liability to being an accessory after the fact. The government conceded that Mueller's testimony to the contrary was false, and deliberately so. Notably, Rausini's disavowal of the responsibility does not appear in the FBI 302 that Mueller relied upon in his disingenuous efforts to undermine Rausini's credibility. The stipulation amounts to a concession by the government that Mueller relied upon evidence, the FBI 302 report, that he knew was false to bolster his lies. The government also admitted that, contrary to Mueller's testimony, Rausini had in fact implicated Barrero and Farchione in the Estes murder conspiracy and had identified Farchione as the individual who ordered the killing. Essentially, the government stipulation conceded that Mueller's testimony was false. The stipulation was also a concession that the FBI 302 report of Mueller's interview with Rausini was prepared in such a manner as to cover up the issue of law enforcement complicity in the Estes murder and to conceal that an unauthorized disclosure by someone on the FBI's task force had led to the killing of a federal informant. The government also acknowledged that, contrary to Mueller's testimony, Mueller and the FBI had failed to investigate the allegation of FBI corruption. Mueller did not follow up on any leads into the issue of law enforcement complicity in the Estes murder, including, among other matters, the fact that Barrero leaked confidential information which had led to Estes' murder. The 2013 stipulation amounts to a concession that Mueller's 2011 testimony to the contrary was false. As I look over the government's motion, I ask, why hasn't anybody looked into this? Everything is under seal, and if there's one thing I've learned about the prosecutors working my case, they'll say whatever they have to say to keep this thing under wraps. The afternoon of the sentencing, seated in the courtroom, along with Lance Estes' godfather, James Harrell, were Estes' brothers, Darren and Michael, as well as his former fiancée, Monica Trujillo, the woman whose life Rausini may have saved. In addition, there were a smattering of law enforcement spectators. Shortly thereafter, the judge expressed the variables which influenced her deliberation, eventually stating, "I think that, although the government had a case, it didn't have as good a case without Mr. Rausini because he put all the pieces together. And how was he able to do it? Because he was the one in charge of the whole operation." As for Balog's request for a 15-year reduction, she said, "In the court's view, it's simply too much time." Instead, she pronounced that Rausini's sentence should be reduced from 40 years to 34 years. "You got 20 years for a murder that, it certainly appears, Aria ordered, and an additional 20 years for conspiring to commit a murder that Rausini hadn't conspired to commit." He shrugged. "Look, I don't know what happened. I know I didn't order it. Rausini tells me, between the Estes and Ellenberger homicides, what he's most upset over is that, to this day, the Ellenberger family believes that he was responsible for killing their loved one. Estes is more complicated. Rausini admits that he knew that a contingency plan was in place to kill Estes if he arrived without the bribe money. However, Estes had led Rausini to believe that he was bringing the money, even if he were vicariously liable. The government, nevertheless, shifted the blame to Rausini in order to conceal the FBI's misconduct. Pierre Rausini will be released from the Bureau of Prisons in October 2025. Author's note: if you're as fascinated by the story as I am, please buy the expanded version of the true crime exposé, Devil Exposed, The Abridgment, a twisted tale of drug trafficking, corruption, and murder in the City of Angels. Within its pages, I detail the entire conspiracy to frame Rausini. In addition, there are over 120 exhibits, nearly 750 pages of documentation conclusively proving Mueller's extraordinary efforts to obstruct justice. The exhibits can be viewed on devilexposedexhibits.com.